Every child knew about the Sky Ripper. The Transcendent Emperor had buried its pieces deep. And then, this Emperor's horrific sacrifices had brought it back to the surface.
Stories, The Path of Destinies, is a game that I'd had my eye on for a while. Developed by Spearhead, the folks behind Tiny Brains and Arena Cyber Evolution, Stories, The Path of Destinies is an ARPG/adventure game hybrid. It's well worth your time if you're looking for an adventure game with many paths, great writing, and gorgeous visuals. In Stories, you play as a wily fox named Reynardo. As Reynardo, you hack and slash your way through a variety of levels, fighting off vicious crows with 4 different swords, each offering unique abilities. I'll be straightforward. The platforming itself is a little bit lackluster. Besides the crows and the occasional cannonballs, there are relatively few environmental hazards. In the environments, there's just not that much to do outside of combat. It's like The Legend of Zelda, but a little bit less varied. Still, the combat does have some interesting aspects. It plays out a bit like the rhythmic combat of the Arkham games, and it's accompanied by some neat mechanics. For example, you can grab a raven, use it as a shield, and then toss it against its fellow ravens. Or you can just toss it over the edge of a world. Also, the combat felt a little less than responsive sometimes. It's not game-ruining, but it can be a little bit of a nuisance when you put together an awesome string of attacks, and then you're interrupted because the game took a little bit too long to respond, thus ruining your rhythm. That said, the most exciting part of the game isn't really its combat, rather, it's the story, or should I say, the game's stories. At the start of the game, a book opens up, giving you a bit of background on the story. It's a neat bit of presentation. After this, you go through your first playthrough of the game. Now, the first time you play through the game, it'll only take you about 20 to 30 minutes. In that time, you'll have gone through your first story and uncovered some truth about the game, be it truth about the item you purchased, a character you dealt with, or some other aspect of the game and its world. At the end, the book pulls you back through time in order to let you try again, making decisions that are now informed by your experiences. You see, the first time you play, you're gonna fail horribly at whatever your goal was. In between each level, you're presented with choices. Do you chase the strange artifact, or do you try kidnapping the Emperor's daughter? Do you threaten the fate of the universe, or put yourself in danger instead? The game story is filled with twists and turns from the outset. It's a little bit difficult to talk about because it's non-linear and easy to spoil. I do, however, feel comfortable saying that it's very well written. The story mainly focuses on 3 main characters: Reynardo, the player, Lapino, his crafty old rabbit friend, and Zenobia, Reynardo's estranged friend who happens to be the Emperor's adopted daughter, and perhaps Reynardo's love interest. The best of the writing comes through the narrator, who explains what's going on in the story, voices the characters like a person reading a bedtime story, and occasionally cracks fourth-wall-breaking jokes.
The far-speaker toad came hopping out.
Reynardo!
It croaked, sounding like a toad version of Zenobia.
Don't use the Sky Ripper! You'll destroy the world!
Yeah, sure it will, cracked Reynardo. Pull the other one.
If you don't trust me, go see Calavera. He'll tell you the same thing.
Oh, she would say that. That sounded sensible. Why did she always have to sound sensible all the time? Oh, it was infuriating. Of course she would say that.
Voiced by Julian Casey, I have no complaints about the quality of his voice acting, which was wonderfully enthusiastic, with just the right blend of sarcasm and silliness. I also loved his jokes, which sometimes poked fun at ARPG tropes. There's something about the way the game combined a narrator with choose-your-own-adventure mechanics that reminded me of Bastion and the new King's Quest in the best of ways. You can use the truth that you've uncovered to help guide your path as you progress through the game. Your truth also opens up new paths to you. This is a game that you'll fail your way through several times before you actually succeed. On the one hand, the combat aspect of the gameplay is relatively satisfying, and since you spend some time gaining levels and improving your swords, the Ice Sword is most definitely the best, it's not so bad that you spend so much time fighting, even though there are only a few sorts of enemies. For once, I think it would have been nice to have bosses in a game, since it might have broken up the monotony of beating up the 4 same ravens over and over again. From an aesthetic standpoint, Stories is fantastic. The whole game takes place on a series of floating islands, and they vary a lot. There are dusty desert islands, a dark lair full of mad scientists, with a secret mountain base full of rebels. Each environment looks unique and has its own lush scenery as well as weather. Unfortunately, I did encounter some frame rate drops in some of the more graphically intense regions. Where the snow tended to blow, for instance, I often found my frame rate falling. This is an issue for both the PlayStation 4 and PC versions of the game. It's not that big a deal, but it does make combat a little bit trickier. It'll likely be fixed in a future patch. The game's music is pretty decent. To be honest, most of it blended into the background and didn't really stand out to me, except for the game's darker theme that played while going down an evil path. Imagine, if you can, a heavy, almost angry-sounding choir as you slash your way through a cloud of black raven feathers. It really did a good job at setting the mood. On the whole, Stories, The Path of Destinies is a great game. While it can get a touch repetitive at some points, it's not quite so long that you'll get sick of it. If you enjoy adventures, games in which stories play a big role, and games with lovable animal protagonists, check out Stories. Now, just a quick heads up, the story can get a touch dark at some points. There are some endings in which you, the player, die terribly. That said, your death is never graphic or disturbing. I've seen more disturbing illustrations in children's books. That said, if you have little kids, they might find some of the game's sadder endings upsetting. If you'd like to find out more about Stories and its development process, be sure to check out our interview from PAX East 2016 with Atul Mehra, one of the developers of the game.
There was a hole in the air, a blackness like a tear in a parchment. Wind was blowing into it, widening it. It grew larger. Crates were falling off ship decks upwards into the hole, and the world itself seemed bent like the reflection on a curved mirror as it poured into the ravenous hole. He guessed that somewhere behind that ever-widening hole were gods that had long been exiled. But it didn't really matter. Time was done for here, and soon it was.